Hello, online classes for fall 2015. I greet you here on October the 20th as dappled sunlight comes through the blinds here on a Tuesday morning. Moving on into Chapter 13, we'll have 2 more chapters after today for our recorded lectures. And certainly those of you that have been watching these recorded lectures, which you can get on Blackboard Collaborate, you have some questions that you're prepared to answer on the online quizzes and our tests that you won't find from the book. A lot of this material is just reminding you of some of the key points in the book, but there's some other issues as well, as you'll see here certainly in Chapter 13. Chapter 13, the presidency. Well, we've talked about re-election, and we've focused on the re-election of Congress, in which almost all members of Congress are re-elected. We do see, though, that there's a smaller percentage of people that are presidents that are re-elected. So the re-election process, then, for a president is a little more difficult. And since 1824, 15 presidents have been re-elected. 9 have been defeated. So there is a process in which some individuals can be defeated. But 63% are re-elected. Notice that when we were talking about this House and the Senate and Congress, there was up to 90%, over 90% in some elections in which people are re-elected. So it's a lower percentage there. We can see that we've had some presidents, President Obama in this situation. That's a pretty low overall percentage when it comes to his re-election, although that's still a majority. But it's a slight majority, as we can see there in 2012. And some of the other presidents and their close re-election bids, at least when it comes to the popular vote. This is the presidential seal, and certainly anytime you have an opportunity to see a president, I think it would be worth going through that effort to see it, because you just see the image of the presidency, the Secret Service, the limousines, the helicopters involved. There's a lot of security involved in the presidency. And let's do keep in mind that if there wasn't security, when we've had times in which presidents have tried to reach out and meet the public, it's worked out, unfortunately, for the president. President Lincoln going to enjoy a play among the public. He's shot. President Garfield waiting for a train among the public in Washington, D.C. He's shot. President McKinley in Buffalo, New York, waiting to meet the population and shake hands with everybody who would like to meet him, and he's shot. President Kennedy, open limousine as he drives through downtown Dallas, and he's shot. So there's a reason why there's security for the presidents. We probably are not too surprised to know that there's quite a few people that have access to weapons here in the United States. And so to have then a president that's available to the public, that leads to some major security issues. And so you certainly do get the sense that this is a very important person based on security around the president. These are the top 10 presidents. By most historical accounts, you'll see some variations in the polling. But if you ask historians and political scientists, this is generally the list that you will find. There'll be some lists that may not have Reagan or Jackson or Eisenhower in the list and maybe replaced with presidents like James K. Polk, for example. But this is generally the fairly consistent list that you see there. And one of the things that you can see in almost all the presidents is that they didn't reduce the size of government. They actually expanded the size of the government in most cases. And of course that leads to some questions about why these individuals are on that list. Even someone like Andrew Jackson, who did not support the National Bank, but he did support, of course, expanding the physical size of the United States, and he wanted to strengthen the national government in terms of its military, and he didn't support states seceding from the Union. And even President Reagan, who's known to talk a lot about reducing the size of government, but actually he reduced the size of the military, which is, of course, part of the government. So, just down the list quickly to think about ways in which the reason why these individuals are on the list, and again, generally it comes back to strengthening strengthening the size of the federal government. Abraham Lincoln, the Union, Civil War, ending slavery, we know about those issues. George Washington, first president, really started to establish the role of the presidency and the role of the federal government. Franklin Roosevelt, Great Depression, trying to get the United States out of the Great Depression and then also succeeding in World War II. Harry Truman finishing World War II, rebuilding Europe after World War II. Thomas Jefferson, third president, expanding the size of the United States with the Louisiana Purchase. Teddy Roosevelt, expanding the role of the United States in Latin America and Central America. Andrew Jackson, again, strengthening the United States and its relationship with European countries, and also then its relationship with tribal governments and all other colonies among European powers. Ronald Reagan, fighting communism, increasing the size of the military. Woodrow Wilson, expanding the role of the federal government in terms of areas like Food and Drug Administration, meat inspection. He did that along with Teddy Roosevelt. And then also, of course, fighting in World War I. Dwight Eisenhower, not so much increasing any activity in a war. In fact, he got the United States out of Korea, for example, which was something that happened during Truman's presidency. But he did expand the size of the government in terms of the interstate highway system, for example, and started the process of civil rights that we saw very actively in our country in the 1960s. This is the bottom 10, and it's not by decreasing the size of the federal government that they're on this list, but just generally failing to be very successful. And maybe that was of their own activities or perhaps just some bad luck. That could be partly what we see here. And again, quickly just go down the list. James Buchanan, president right up to the Civil War, and did nothing to stop the succession of southern states while he was still president. Warren Harding, a lot of scandals in the 1920s, died in office. Andrew Johnson, president after Abraham Lincoln, he was impeached in office, was not able to resolve some of the key differences in rebuilding the country after the Civil War. Franklin Pierce, president in the 1850s, did very little to end the process towards the Civil War. Millard Fillmore, the same way during his presidency in the 1850s. So, I have a lot of presidents in the 1850s that are deemed to be failures, and maybe more than anything else, it's just the situation that no president was able to be very successful during that time, but they're listed as failures, or in the bottom 10 at least. John Tyler, first president to replace a president who died in office. William Henry Harrison died. And the first president to die in office, he was only there for about a month. Tyler takes over, really can't get anything done. He's a president as a member of the Whig Party, although he had been a Democrat for many years. Now the Democrats don't trust him, the Whigs don't trust him, and he's not very effective. U.S. Grant, president in the 1870s, and again, just not a very effective president in terms of a lot of scandals that occurred while he's president. He was a great general during during the Civil War, but not very successful as a president. Now, we're starting to consider in many ways that Grant was a successful president in terms of civil rights, but in many ways, because of the scandals, not very successful. Richard Nixon, president, late 60s, early 70s in the 1900s, and the first president and the only president in our history to resign from the office. Herbert Hoover, leading up to the Great Depression, was president during the Great Depression, late 20s, early 30s, and didn't seem to have a very effective way at trying to end the Depression. Zachary Taylor, another president, trying to resolve the differences between the North and South leading up to the Civil War, not very successful. You do have some individuals on here, again, Grant in the North in the Civil War, and Zachary Taylor during the Mexican War. They're both considered to be two of the best generals in American history. And so you have two generals on the bottom 10, and you have another general, another very successful general from World War II, Dwight Eisenhower in the top 10. So, maybe being a general might help, or maybe it's not such a great position to be in when you're running for office to be president. Of course, Washington, also a general, and considered to be a very successful president. This is the oath of office. This is what every president is to participate in. This is in the Constitution, so it's required that someone take this oath of office. And notice in here, defend the Constitution of the United States, execute the office of the President, and defend the Constitution of the United States. That's the key part of the oath, as you can see there. So you can see what part of the Constitution you can find this oath. Article 2, Section 1. Interesting, though, is the question, is the Constitution a suicidal pact? And so for many presidents, they can say, we understand what the oath tells us to do, to defend the Constitution. But is the Constitution a suicidal pact? And this is showing the aftermath of the Boston bombing during the Boston Marathon, if you recall, a couple of years ago. Are presidents then to say, let's honor the Constitution, even if it may put people at risk? Are we to do things that perhaps are questionable with the Constitution if we are to secure greater protections for the American people? And that, of course, becomes an ongoing question. And most presidents are going to say, we will, in a sense, play fast and loose with the Constitution in the process of trying to ensure greater security. And most presidents have gone down that road. These are the presidential powers of the president, so based on the Constitution. So you can see here, as Commander-in-Chief of the military, that's where a president may come in and say, that's how we are to ensure security for the public. And that's a constitutional requirement. And so if that means that we do things that could be challenging to the structure of the Fourth Amendment or the Fifth Amendment or the Sixth Amendment, it's still part of the role is to secure the country as Commander-in-Chief of the military. But beyond that, we can see to be in charge of the bureaucracy, to convene Congress, to veto legislation, to make appointments, to negotiate and make treaties, and to grant pardons. Notice that almost all those areas, there's going to be a check on the power of the president. We can go back to Chapter 2 there and think about checks and balances. The one area where there's not a check is to grant pardons. The president can pardon someone who's suspected of committing a federal crime, who has committed a federal crime, who is in prison for a federal crime, who's being tried for a federal crime. They can pardon that individual. Now, that can lead to a lot of questions by the public to go that route, and most presidents are fairly reluctant to use that pardon power, and generally they won't do it until the end of their presidency. But it's still something that is not that they have a limitation by Congress or the Supreme Court in that process. But the other areas, negotiate and make treaties. The Senate has to approve of those treaties. To make appointments, most of those appointments have to be approved by the Senate. To veto legislation, the Congress can override the veto. They can convene Congress, but they can't tell Congress how to vote. And bureaucracy, simply just because of the size and the skill of bureaucracy, may be very difficult for a president to control the bureaucracy. And beyond that also, Commander-in-Chief of the military, it's Congress that has the power to formally declare war. So that can lead to a limitation of the president, even in that Commander-in-Chief role. So we can see here with vetoes, that's one of the ways that Congress can limit the power of the president. But we can also see there are many instances in which that just doesn't happen. 528 in your text, you can see here, there's Andrew Johnson. He's the one that had a good portion of his vetoes overridden. Most presidents have very few of those vetoes actually overridden. It's a major undertaking by Congress to override a veto, especially in our two-party system, going back to Chapter 9, where a president will generally have the support of members of his own party. And unless that party is such a weak minority, then the president's going to have a backing to sustain his veto. Johnson was in a position where he was just so weak. The Democrats were very weak right after the Civil War, and was after he had taken over after Lincoln. He just really didn't have congressional backing for his vetoes. But 2,562 vetoes total, at least at the publication of the book. Only 109 have been overridden. And so President Grover Cleveland, just to give you some idea, most of them are not this successful, but it's pretty overwhelming here. Cleveland, who was president in the 1800s, our only president to be elected, defeated, and then reelected. Grover Cleveland got 414, as you can see, there vetoes, and only 2 overridden in his first term as president. But again, as we mentioned, there are some ways to limit the power of the president. Here's some of the institutions that can limit the power of a president. Congress, we've talked about the formal ways that they can do that. Bureaucracy, just again, the size and skill of the bureaucracy. Does the president really know who's in the CIA? Does the president know how much funding the CIA exactly gets? It's probably not really possible for a president to know that. Not to the penny, that's for sure, and not to every member of the personnel within the Central Intelligence Agency. Supreme Court, of course, they have lifetime appointments. They can find the president's actions to be unconstitutional. The public can just simply say we're not going to vote for the individual again or give them low approval ratings, and that can harm a president's ability to negotiate with Congress and negotiate with other countries and negotiate with states. So it's important to have that public approval rating. And the press can just really knock a president around when it comes to how they report on a president. This is a way in which the president can get the country into a war situation and can use the military, but at the same time the Congress wants to have some sort of say. And again, think about our own history here. The last time there was a formal declaration of war, we're talking about World War II. So all these other wars, most of the wars the United States has been involved in throughout our history did not involve Congress formally declaring war. And so, I mean, all these wars in which, think about the Indian Wars, where you had the cavalry fighting American Indian tribes. That didn't; those weren't votes by Congress. And certainly, of course, 2 of the better-known wars in the Cold War period, the Korean War and the Vietnam War, not voted on by Congress. So at the end of the Vietnam Wars, you can see here in 1973, Congress tries to come up with a way of saying we're going to have a voice in the direction of the use of the military in a wartime situation. So consult Congress in every possible instance. Report to both houses within 48 hours of the conflict. Terminate deployment within 60 days of initial report unless Congress approves a 30-day extension. Well, how useful then is the War Powers Act? Because if you look at the third point there, after 60 days in the field, Congress could technically, if the president doesn't give them another report, our initial report, and doesn't continue to say that, you know, this is the reason why we need to have the military involved, Congress could yank the funding and end the event, but that's never happened, and probably would never happen. What Congress would vote to say we're going to cut off funding to military troops who are in the field of operation? More than likely not going to happen. So this always then leads to the question of the effectiveness of the War Powers Act. Way before the War Powers Act, you had Teddy Roosevelt, one of our highest-ranking presidents, who sent the Navy out on a tour of the world tour. Let everyone know that the United States has a really strong Navy, and send that powerful message to a lot of countries around the world. And some of his assistants said to President Roosevelt that Congress hasn't supported the funding for this. And he said, well, as Commander-in-Chief, it's my power to send the Navy on a world tour. As the body of government that has the power of the purse strings, it will be Congress's power to get them back. So in other words, once they're out on the tour, who's going to leave the U.S. Navy on a dock in someplace in Spain, let's say, and they're waiting for funding to refuel the ships? Not going to happen. they're going to get to go home. The Libyan conflict, which happened a few years back, which is in our news, of course. If you look at presidential politics right now, and Benghazi report, as you hear, and the status of Libya right now, Libyan hostilities not requiring congressional support. There was the idea that there weren't any military personnel on the ground. Drones were being used. You had support within the country. And by all accounts, there was no conflict, no casualties among American military personnel in the overthrow of a brutal dictator in Libya, a guy named Muammar Gaddafi. So in that situation, can you conclude that it was within the boundaries of the power of the president in terms of the commander-in-chief? And that's certainly the argument that the Obama administration has made. Well, the qualifications to be the president, there's only 3 constitutional qualifications to be president. Must be 35 years of age, must be a natural-born citizen, and must have lived in the United States at least 14 years. Most of the time, there's not a lot of questions raised about this, although let's bear in mind that in the 2016 presidential election for the Republican Party, one of the candidates running is a guy named Ted Cruz. His real first name is Rafael Cruz. And he was born in Canada. I mean, it's right there on his birth certificate. His father was a Cuban national, but his mother was an American citizen. So their argument is, and no one's challenged this, to say that natural born means that your mother was born in the United States. So unless someone challenges that, someone being at least one of his opponents or somebody with financial means to bring this all the way to the Supreme Court, then I suppose that's what it counts. There's different definitions of natural. You know, it's natural born in the United States. It's generally been accepted that way, but here we have a candidate who's running who was not born in the United States or the territory of the United States. In 2008, we had the first time ever in our history where we had 2 candidates that were not born in the continental United States. Barack Obama was born in Hawaii, although that was a state when he was born. And then you had John McCain, who was born in the Panama Canal Zone, which was a territory of the United States at that time. But here we have a candidate running for president who was born in a foreign country. He was born in Canada, and his father was not an American citizen. But since his mother was, that so far has been enough of an argument to say he's a natural-born citizen. The presidents before Obama were pretty consistent in terms of their ethnicity and their religion. A few exceptions, but not too much. So I'm just kind of sharing that here with you, that we didn't have a lot of variety among our presidents. And so in that sense, President Obama has been revolutionary, just in the idea that here's somebody who is of an African American who's elected president. So we don't have a lot of variety among the European backgrounds of people who are running for president, and throughout our whole history up to President Obama. And of course, we've never elected a woman to be president. And in terms of religion, most people are members of a mainstream Protestant church, mostly Baptist, Methodist, Episcopalian, or Presbyterian. We've had few people. William Howard Taft, for example, was a Unitarian, though that church is generally referred to as a deist faith, believing that God created the world and then moved on, is not really active in the interactions of human beings today. You also have some individuals like Abraham Lincoln that was not a member of a church. And so you have some differences there. President Obama is a member of the United Church of Christ. So he's still a member of a fairly mainstream church, Protestant church. Presidential character, some of the differences that we see among presidents. This is a contribution made by a political scientist named James David Barber. And one of the things to look at here, this is a fascinating book to read if you're interested in the history of the presidency and kind of the psychological makeup of many of our presidents. This is a great book to read. Well, Barber's argument is that personality matters to a president. And it's worth considering when you're wanting to vote for someone? Do you vote for someone based on his or her personality? And maybe that's a typical reaction. It is a little interesting to think that way, right? I mean, how often are we ever going to actually interact personally with the president? Ever have lunch with the president? Ever, have our kids go to the soccer game with the president? Probably not going to happen. But we may be thinking, if that did happen, which of these individuals would we like the most? And so does personality matter when it comes to the presidency? Barbara would say yes. Having certain types of personalities does suggest a greater likelihood of success for a president. So an active, positive president would be someone like Franklin Roosevelt that you see here. And so Roosevelt was a successful president, and Barbara would argue in part that he was a successful president because he had a very good type of personality. Active, positive is the best type. So there's two variables here: the activity of a president, active or passive. So he was active as a president. He was involved. He enjoyed the job, and he spent a lot of time with the job. But then the outlook of the job. So you have the physical activity. Even though we know that his physical activity personally was limited, his way of approaching the job meant that he was active. And then the outlook, is it positive or negative? You have a positive sense of going to work every day and believing that you can make a difference. And so in that sense, some presidents are better at that than others. And the negative view is, of course, that you don't feel that it's very successful. Maybe you don't really like being president. So an iconic photo here of Roosevelt suggests that he enjoyed being president. He enjoyed meeting the public. He enjoyed campaigning. And so that's some of the interesting parts that you can see there. This is the best type of personality to have, according to Barber, the active positive. Passive positive, and we have a picture of Reagan. And I use in this list, though, presidents that are identified by Barber as these categories, but do go on to suggest that you can still be a successful president, even though your personality, as Barber argues, is not maybe the best for the presidency. So clearly Reagan was positive, but one of the questions about Reagan was his activity level as president and his willingness to allow others to step forward and take over within his administration. At least that's the historical suggestion through research, that Reagan was like that. So a passive positive, not, as we can see, not active in the role of administration or in the presidency. So they're letting others take over within the administration. Passive negative, and so I mean in this case the picture here of Dwight Eisenhower belies that he wouldn't really be that way, and so perhaps what it means is that Eisenhower was able to put up a good front when he was out there with the public campaigning. As we can see here in this picture, he seems to be enjoying himself. But a passive negative president is one who really doesn't like being president. That still, once again, as we can see with the success of his presidency, that Eisenhower obviously knew how to be a successful president, even if maybe he didn't really like being president. And perhaps we can't discount physical health. Dwight Eisenhower had a massive heart attack while he was president, and he was laid up for many months. And so maybe that had something to do with his inability to perhaps project an active role as a president. And then we have active negative. This is really the worst personality to have. And an active negative president, Woodrow Wilson, also on that top 10 list. But this is a person who's very active, but also very paranoid and not willing to compromise, and has real problems of working with other individuals. And Wilson was clearly that way at the end of World War I in terms of trying to establish a League of Nations, even though the Republicans had the majority in the Senate. The Democrat Woodrow Wilson didn't really negotiate with them, and the whole process of creating the treaty or getting the treaty approved He believed that he was doing the Lord's work, and there was no reason to make any change to the treaty. Now, let's also, again, physical health. What role does that play? Because he had a stroke near the end of his presidency, and during this whole process of trying to get the League of Nations at the end of World War II approved, you had Woodrow Wilson pretty much in a bid in the White House, who could only move one of his arms, couldn't speak, and the rest of his body was fairly paralyzed. And his wife was pretty much determining who could see him and who couldn't, and only his wife and doctor really knew about the status of his overall health at that time. But personality-wise, maybe the personality helped to lead to the stroke. That could be part of the question that's raised there about the background there of Woodrow Wilson. But the worst personality type to have. But nevertheless, notice there, from all four of those personalities, passive, active, positive, the best type, active role, positive outlook, Franklin D. Roosevelt there, successful president. Passive, positive, you have a positive outlook, but not a real active role, but Ronald Reagan's on that list, successful president. Passive, negative, not really involved in wanting to be president, and yet Dwight Eisenhower is on that list and a successful president. Active, negative, a potentially dangerous role to have, and yet Woodrow Wilson's on that list, again, as a successful president. But what does it come down to on being a successful president? How do we determine what will be a successful president? Well, a great general and an emperor was asked that question, Napoleon Bonaparte. What made a general great? What was the greatest attribute for a general? And maybe the person who was asking him that question caught Bonaparte on a dark day. I don't know. Maybe he was just a little grumpy. But Napoleon answered, luck. Luck was the greatest attribute for a general. You had to be lucky. So when it all boils down to everything, is that the difference among our presidents, that some are luckier than others? I imagine most of us don't want to conclude that really comes down to why one president is successful and another president is not. But that's part of at least one person's perspective on leadership. Notice here the advisors to the president. Be sure and check these pages. There's an excellent chart that shows these four different entities of advisors that are in a way competing for the president's time and information and the direction of the presidency. So you have the cabinet, executive office, White House staff, independent agencies, and government corporations. Read about these differences on pages 535 to 537. It's worth noting then, as you look over those charts and read those pages, that a president is not you're not electing just one individual to the presidency. So as you vote in 2016 and you decide who you want to be president, you're not just voting for that one individual. You're voting for all the other individuals that will be brought into the White House. And so it's worth considering that if you vote for a Republican to be president, where are they going to get those collection of advisors? Who was the last Republican president? I mean, they're going to have to turn to the George W. Bush presidency. If you elect a Democrat, who will they turn to get their collection of advisors? More than likely, the Obama administration. If not the Obama administration, they'll have to go back several years to go to the Clinton administration. But that's just part of the process. Are you able to find hundreds of new advisors that weren't attached to a past president? More than likely, that's just not going to happen. To think about the unthinkable is the idea of having a president that's not able to do the job. Whether you like the president or not at any given time is to consider. If you don't have that individual up physically or mentally up to the job, how do you then get someone else to take over? And there is a process. The 25th Amendment is in place. It's a very detailed amendment. I would urge you to spend some time reading through it. In some cases, it's fairly easily manageable if you have a president just recognizes that for a few hours, let's say during the surgery, the president is not able to do the job, then you turn that role over to somebody else, the vice president, of course. If a president is under anesthesia for an operation, a procedure, and they're going to be that way for, let's say, 3 or 4 hours, well, what can happen in 3 or 4 hours? Well, quite a bit can happen in 3 or 4 hours. So the idea that you need to have someone as president at any given time to make a decision is necessary. The hardcore reality. Throughout our lives, I think we've maybe mentioned this once before, but it's a humbling and somewhat frightening process, and probably one we don't want to think about it much. But we are 30 minutes away from nuclear holocaust at any given time. That's the reality of the world. 30 minutes away from nuclear holocaust. What is the reaction if there's a coup d'etat, an overthrow of the government in China, and a militarist individual takes over the government of China, and now they load up a bomber with nuclear weapons, and they fly the bomber out of China airspace, they cross on over into our allies' airspace in South Korea, or go on over into Japan on their way to Hawaii. At what point does the president say we have to intercept that plane? What do we do? What should be done? Should the plane be shot down? Do you shoot it down without even calling China? Do you call Russia? Do you call France, United Kingdom? Do you call South Korea? Do you tell Congress? And how much time do you have to make those decisions? So there you can see the process of needing someone there to make a decision. One of the big questions I would say that conclude on the presidency is, what is the role of the president in a democracy? But let's please keep in mind, we're not a democracy. We're not just a democracy, even if we are a democracy. We're an empire, and we're a significant empire. We're the kind of empire that would make Augustus Caesar weep out of jealousy. And there's Augustus Caesar over on the left. He never would have had as much power as we have right now. So what role should there be for the president in that situation? How active should the president be? And are we giving up the power of the presidency to be more like a democracy and less like an empire? Are we willing to do that? We, the American people, willing to be less like an empire? Those are questions that collectively we have to decide. And certainly the elections coming up will have something to do about that. All right, we'll stop there. That's Chapter 13, the presidency. We'll be moving on to bureaucracy, Chapter 14, in our next recorded lecture.